I'll be your judge. And we've got our lovely chair here who'll be doing the timing. So everyone's, of course, had the briefing. I'll just wait till our chair's set up, ready to time, and then we'll kick off with the first speaker. But we're just also getting the technology set up. When you're ready, you're welcome to take a seat beside me.
Just making sure this is... We would have just double check, sorry. Oh, we able to just double check. Is that error? Okay. Is that supposed to be more?
Well.
We're sorry about that.
That's all right.
Oh, that's perfectly fine. It just means that
It's just gonna be
it's just going to be a little laggy.
okay. That's okay.
Everyone can feel the audio will be fine.
Great.
So that's all good. Great job, guys.
Now, are you going to do a clap?
Yeah.
All right, great. So the chair will be doing a clap. For time amongst. Everyone hear that? Amazing. Okay, well, I'm excited. Let's get started. Without further ado, I would like to welcome up the first speaker of the Affirmative team to begin the debate.
The trend in history has always been that the next century will always be better than the last. It is incredibly unclear to me why this specific century is going to break this cycle and make people live meaningfully worse lives in their world. I'm going to do three things in this speech then. First, some setup. Second, why your quality of life likely improves. Secondly, or thirdly, why your security and safety improves in 100 years' time. 2 points on setup then. First is that where you are born in this debate is inherently a random draw. This means that we are debating from a blind perspective where you cannot choose where you will be born. This means that you're most likely in the status quo going to be born into a developing country in 2025. This is because, firstly, child mortality rates in developing countries are incredibly high because they're far less prosperous, which means on trend, the birth rates in these countries are significantly higher, and you're more likely to be born in general in that way. But secondly, there's just far higher population in developing countries overall. Our strategy here then is to show that there's just fewer people living in developing countries overall to combat this, but just know here in the status quo, you're likely to be born in these less prosperous countries. Secondly, on setup then, what is our strategy to win this debate? First is we're able to show that the world gets better for the people who will be alive in 100 years' time. Secondly, even if the world does get worse between now and 100 years in the future where we're to be born, what we can prove then is that the kind of adaptation means that the only people who were that means that the only people who were born in that time have it better off. For instance, maybe islands in the Pacific are sinking currently in the short term, but that means, and that's a harm in the short term, right? But in 100 years' time, when they've already sunk and are uninhabitable, there's no way that you're likely to be born into those worlds in the first place, which means you never feel the harm of that world. Before I move on to explain why quality of life likely improves, I'll take a point.
In 50 years, an estimated 150 million climate refugees will exist. How does your side deal with the demonstrable harms our environment will have on a person that's born 100 years from now?
Fantastic. That proves our point, because if a significant amount of climate change refugees happen are going to be around in 50 years, that means in 100 years' time, they've already settled into these regions. There's no way you can be born into a sinking island where nobody is living there, which means that you buy a material that you're living off a better life in that front. Why then will your quality of life improve? This talks about the economic and political and cultural landscape of these worlds. Contextually, given a random draw, your quality of life is likely to be quite harmful in 2025. This is for three reasons. Firstly, Poverty rates are incredibly high as it stands because a majority of countries are like developing and there's a lot of people who have very low amounts of income overall. Secondly, there's a high amount of highly conservative countries. And note this is often linked to economic growth, as we will talk about like later on in this point. But just notice here that if you're an LGBT person, there's a very high likelihood that you're born into a conservative Muslim country where the outcome of you just trying to live like you want to live is the outcome of death. When you're shot or stoned to death in public court, you're never able to feel good about how you live. Thirdly, there's very major uncertainty due to large technological growth, right? We are living in the process of adapting to AI, which is leading to large unemployment, right? For instance, many countries are deindustrializing and switching to service-based economies. That means that if you're born now, you face the harms of that unemployment that comes along, whereas if you're born 100 years' time after that switch has occurred, you're now living off in a far more prosperous society overall. Why is the economy likely to get better in 100 years' time then? Firstly, countries are recovering from the effects of colonialism. And no, colonialism was a very large reason why countries are developing in the status quo because the people in these countries had their labor like abused, where they had to work for no pay, for no personal growth, but also just that their resources were directly taken. No, the growing education of people has led to colonialism reducing currently to a large extent, but that's also just empirically true as it stands. For instance, Nigeria declared independence in 1963. In 63 years later, they have become a major tech center in Africa. This trend continues in the future as countries recover from the effects of colonialism, which means if you're born into these countries that are developing right now, you're like in 100 years' time, you're likely to be far better off for that reason. Secondly, there's way less uncertainty, right? This is because technological change, particularly in the context of AI right now, has already happened in 100 years' time. We already live in a society that is already like adapted to that. That means currently, if you're born, there's a high chance that you're going to be unemployed because the kind of like university degree that you're studying for is no longer a viable option for you. Alternatively, the only kinds of university degrees in the future are going to be ones that are going to have adapted to the existence of AI, which means that's never a harm for you in the first place. Thirdly, there's a culture of sacrifice that exists in our current world, right? That means that that means that the culture that exists currently is about giving up your own like happiness and your own joy if it means that your future generation will grow and be prosperous in the long term. This is very prominent in countries like Asia, in countries like China or other countries in Southeast Asia, where sacrifice is a very big part of your life. But that means that you don't want to be born now, right? You don't want to be born into the world where you're going to have to sacrifice for your generations. Alternatively, on our side, you're just born into the world where you can reap the benefits of the sacrifice because it's far better for you in the long term. Lastly, charity like efforts bring people out of poverty, right? They can like build a lot more wells in Africa, for instance, that mean that people have clean drinking water to be able to go to in the long term. But no, this compounds over time. It means that we're having far better outcomes on this. The outcome here is that you're more likely to be prosperous on our side of the house. It means you're just living a far more materially better life. You're able to go and drink water without being worried that it's going to contaminate you and give you crippling disease. You're able to send your kids to school and feel really good and proud of them when they're able to go to good universities, for instance, or they're able to just have a good and stable job that's very subjectively important for you. Secondly, why society liberalizes in 100 years' time? Firstly, because countries just become more wealthy, right? And when people don't have to worry about putting food on the table, people are happy to sacrifice the perceived stability of conservative narratives. That's why people are more likely, that's why the trend is that as countries become more wealthy, they become more liberal in terms of things like accepting LGBT people. That's just the trend we see in society. And so if you buy the material of economics and think that people are no longer worried about starving, then you buy that people have a far more culturally liberal outcome on our side. But secondly, political activism, which is dangerous in the short term, is likely to pay off in the long term. This is because first, it shifts the Overton window with like more awareness overall, but secondly, changes can be small but compound over time. So if you're an LGBT person now, it's true that you can like do political activism, but it's a very high risk for you, particularly if you're in the countries that you believe that you're likely to be born in. Alternatively, in the world we are born into, you've already been past all that. You don't have to live in a world with this activism because it's already paid off in the long term, and that just means that you can live a free life. You can be who you want to be. You can love the people you want to love, and have families with the people who you actually care about and not conform to some other societal expectation, and that's way better for you. Lastly, I just think technological outcomes are really good for things like health overall, right? Currently, billions of dollars of research go into health research. This is just because there's like public incentives of the government, but also there's private incentives of billionaires who want to live longer. This happens all the time, right? This has happened all throughout history, which is why we get a majority of like our new medicine from. What happens in 100 years' time is this just gets better. There's just fewer diseases that are crippling, and you live a far better life on that front. Secondly, then on security and safety, the key thing here is that we want to talk about here is climate change and wars, right? Firstly, on climate change, I think first there's going to be heavy investment into climate change, right? For instance, there are massive amounts of wind farms or solar farms. China is producing an immense amount of electric vehicles. That just means that the types of emissions are decreasing rapidly currently as we speak. There's going to be more renewable energy overall, right? If you believe that fossil fuels run out in the next 100 years because it's inherently a limited resource, then you believe that our world is one with exclusively renewable tech. And that just means you're less likely to live next to a factory that's burning a bunch of coal and clouding all the air. That means you're breathing in like smog that makes you cough a lot and ruins your lungs and makes you more likely to die. But secondly, I just think we'd like to see things like climate reversal tech, for instance, like carbon capture. That kind of technology is likely to reduce your harms in the long run. At the end of this, the world in 100 years is going to be so much better. I'd much rather be there.
Thank the speaker for that speech. I'd now like to welcome up the first speaker of the Negating team.
I think it is quite egregious for Affirmative to come up here and start painting our current world as this horrible place to live in. Now let me show you why. A few things in this debate. Firstly, on the environment in 100 years. Secondly, on political and economic unrest. And thirdly, on why the current social state is preferable. But firstly, on response. The Affirmative came up here and spent 8 minutes on the assumption of adaptability of the people in the future, right? Here's why this isn't true. Okay, so a few things here. Firstly, not everyone is going to be able to adapt, okay? So App comes up here and starts assuming that everyone is able to adapt to this change. But this isn't true, okay? I'm gonna be banging on this later, but just off the top of my head, when people are in these really bad climate situations, environmental situations that are really bad for them, they're not going to have the capability and the capacity to be able to adapt and change. And okay, moving forward, App's whole case is that their predictions are really positive and it's going to allow people in 100 years time to really thrive. Okay, so we don't really think this is true. So App is really painting this hyperbolic society. And they come up here and they claim that all of these benefits, but it's just not true. And I'm going to show you why in the rest of my speech. Also, the rest of my responses will be integrated in my speech. Firstly, on why the environment in 100 years' time is unlikely to sustain proper well-being. What is the context in this point? In 50 years' time, it is estimated that there will be over 150 million climate refugees, as Manukau already mentioned. In 100 years' time, when we double this number, it's going to be 300 million climate refugees estimated. Note that climate change cannot be stopped. It can only be mitigated. It's an irreversible process. So why are environmentally harmful processes unlikely to stop leading up to in 100 years' time? A few things here. Firstly, companies profit off of product. This is like overfishing. This is like monoculture. But secondly, because consumers benefit off of the product, right? This is increased demand equals to increased supply, such as the demand-supply graph. Thirdly, on how harmful practices are achieved. This is like Temu fast fashion, right? This is like bottles from Temu, right? This is going to get only more and more and more harmful as more of it happens in the future. This means that the environment in 100 years' time will not be looking too hot. Or actually, it's going to be looking very hot at the same time due to global warming. But even if it is minimized to some extent, it can never truly be stopped. Instead of 300 million climate refugees, let's say there's only 100 million climate refugees. Let's say it's mitigated to just 100 million. That's still really bad. How is that figure any better? Well, it is better, but it's not good, is it? We want zero. So why will the environment be unable to sustain well-being? 6 points here. Firstly, islands will sink underwater and people will lose their homes and they'll be unable to find new homes. Which is response to the whole thing about adaptability. Secondly, as global warming and climate change worsens, the frequency of natural disasters will begin to increase. This is things like housing and infrastructure in hospitals that will be heavily affected by this. Thirdly, food will become scarce, right? This means land not being able to be fertile to actually grow crops, and this is going to lead to famine. This looks like farmers not being able to grow really cheap or simple rice and be able to feed their family or be able to sell it on the market. Fourthly, diseases will become worse or new ones will possibly be able to form. This looks like an extreme version of malaria due to extreme heat. But also because people will begin to die and get sick from these extreme conditions, like heat stroke or exhaustion. But here's the thing now, right? Infrastructure is going to be unable to cope with this poor health because hospitals are like now turned to rubble due to disasters, and also because there's just so many people who are getting sick. Like the capacity of the hospital and like the infrastructure here are unable to actually support them. Now on why this is really bad. Well, this means a few things. Firstly, it means there's a lack of nutritious food, if food at all. This looks like reliance on like computer or like processed food, and it's going to lead to a lot of health problems with people. This also means it's just going to be a general lack of food, such as we've already mentioned in terms of famine. Secondly, people are going to constantly get sick. So the weather is going to cause diseases, and there's going to be famine, right? This is going to lead really badly. Also, thirdly, when you are sick, your health facilities will not be able to help you cope. This is because of natural disasters we've already mentioned, right? They're going to be really oversaturated. It's going to be a lot of people getting sick, and the facilities are going to get worse and worse. So what does this do for the debate? Well, it shows that the world that Affirmative is like pushing over here is not really environmentally stable. And outside of the house, it is, which is the current status quo, everything is like pretty good, right? When we weigh this, we can see that outside of the house is a lot better than the other side of the house, and yes, I will take the point.
If the people in 50 years' time, if the people living in the most vulnerable places in 50 years' time have it so have it so bad for them that they're likely to die, how are they going to give birth in 100 years' time to the kinds of people we're talking about?
Well, I think it's like kind of what you said earlier about how as time progresses, we'll be able to like push environmental movements. So I think like what you said there kind of like helps in this case. But I do think that because of climate change, it's like irreversible, right? So like kind of no matter what you do, it's still going to happen. So I think it's like unfair for you, like Affirmative to come up here and claim that in 100 years' time, this like issue is going to be gone, because it quite literally cannot. Okay, moving on to political and economic unrest. So what is the context for this point? Well, firstly, on overdevelopment. As we progress through time, there's going to be a lot more development, right? This is like just a fact. We can all agree with this. But what this means in 100 years' time, it looks like robots and being in industries. And also like robots doing jobs instead of people. Secondly, on like land deteriority. It means that lands will become overdeveloped and farms will be on like the back burners, right? Because farmers no longer really are like the main focus of supermarkets now, which means they're no longer be able to get the crops into supermarkets. So what are the myths? Okay, firstly, this means overdevelopment, and that means loss of jobs. So overdevelopment causes jobs to be overtaken by like robots, like AI. There's no longer an incentive for businesses to invest in paying people if they can just make like a one-time purchase on like a robot, and then they can just live off of that. There's no more incentive for them to actually consistently pay their workers. Secondly, people will no longer be able to make a living out of crops. So for all of the farmers currently who are like in these really difficult situations, in these really small developing countries, they're no longer able to actually get crops. They're no longer able to actually farm crops. Farmers will begin to lose money, and they no longer sustain the life that they've been living. This also means they're no longer able to like sustain their families with crops, because again, like really cheap things like rice and stuff are no longer able to actually be grown. Thirdly, on what happens when the environment goes bad. This is really important because people will start looking for refuge as like their islands are sinking, right? We've mentioned this already. Due to climate change, the islands are going to start sinking. So they're going to start looking for refuge. And when they go to like a country and they say, hey, I need like 1,000 people in your country in like the next 10 days, that country's going to say, what the hell? No, I don't want that. They're not going to allow these people, they're going to deny them at the border. What this means is political unrest. So on to impacting. Firstly, on job loss and economy. People won't be able to look after their families. This looks like a single mother unable to buy food for their newborn baby because she's just lost a job. But this also means that people cannot buy things like vegetables or food for cheap amounts of money. This also looks like political unrest. This is like when the economy goes really bad, people will start to blame people of color. Think about the Dawn raids, right? New Zealand was at the height of its economy, then suddenly everything crashed. The economy is really bad, and then they start pushing the agenda that the people who have brown skin are actually the reason of this. Think about World War II, when people start pushing the agenda that Jews are actually the reason why there's a lot of jobs, right? This means war. Thirdly, really quickly on why the current social state of the world is more preferable. Context, we see that when economic and political downfall occurs, like they're like likely to do so 100 years from now, it means that people will turn on one another. Next for this point. Firstly, this division is what leads to the collapse of social unity. Comparatively, on our side of the house, we nurture social unity by allowing people the capacity to like actually care and act about it. That's really unique, and that's only on our side of the house. On to next. Firstly, this means like comparatively with the aforementioned issues, it means that they start losing like actual care about that, such as the environment. But this also means that the like large amounts of like there's going to be a lot more opportunities for us to nurture culture, whereas on their side of the house they actually start losing that. On to impact. This means a lot of happiness and freedom. This looks like people being able to live and focus on your life and the social issues that you want to focus on. This looks like traveling to like a debate tournament in Wellington without worrying about it being underwater in 100 years' time. This means that we have the unique benefit of this. At the end of the day, it's really just about weighing up the options and taking a look at both sides of the house. Do you want to live in uncertainty, or do you want to live in certainty? That is the case that we propose how to negate. Oh, my fingers.
Thank the speaker for that speech. I'd now like to welcome up the second speaker of the Affirmative team.
The world in 100 years is not going to be as morbid as Nick tries to tell us. In fact, I think it's probably worse, and you have a lot more uncertainty if you're born in today's world compared to if you're born in 100 years. Two things in my speech, then first I'll be responding, and then third I'll just be offering some more substantive, second I'll be offering some more substantive contributions. First then, on response, the first thing that they tell us is that adaptability doesn't happen because not everyone has the capacity to. I think that it's pretty clear, if you don't have the capacity to, adapt and move to another place, you're probably not in the position to reproduce, to have children. You're probably very unlikely to be born in that situation. But then moving on to the environment, the first thing that they tell us on this is that there's a lot of climate refugees, there's a lot of islands sinking, this terrible malaria. First response to this is that because there's lots of islands sinking, the people who lived on these islands are probably either moved away or they just simply don't exist, meaning they can't reproduce and you're not going to be born on a sinking island. But then secondly, how does the environment actually change? I think the environment can maybe even get better, or at least stay where it is right now, because one, people care a lot and know that this deals with the material about processes not stopping and the frequency of global warming increasing, right? Because I think that when people do care a lot, they feel the impacts of this. Young people are taught in school from a very young age about climate change, about the impacts it has on us. It's something that's unique to this generation. But what this also means is that you have a lot of people doing things like going out and petitioning, making speeches, raising awareness, voting for parties that they know are going to support their climate change policies. That's why climate change doesn't get as bad as they want us to believe. I think also when the government just sees that there's these terrible, tangible impacts on their people, when they have natural disasters, they're probably going to want to do something about this as well. The climate probably doesn't get super bad. But then second of all, Rudy Bruce told you that you have lots of funding into technology. What this looks like is that you have right now universities investigating new chemicals which they can put and help benefit the ozone layer. It also looks like lots of people are building seawalls, lots of people are building dams. This is the stuff that actually helps and reverse the impacts of climate change. We also told you about carbon capture, these EVs. All of this means that the technology it just helps climate change stay the same, or at least it reduces what's happening. You also have things like sustainable energy sourcing, like solar panels, like wind turbines. These are getting larger and more powerful. Over time, in 100 years, the climate impacts are going to be as bad as they want you to believe. And note that this works because one, you have a lot of money, but second, people care. And third of all, you just have a lot of attention on these issues because at the point at which people are facing really bad quality of life because it keeps them being sight closed, people are going to have a lot of attention, they're going to care about this. But note that this also gets better with time because you have things like quantum computing, like 3D digital modeling, which allows researchers and scientists to be able to implement these things and research these things in a very effective way, meaning that you're probably able to reverse or at least, make sure that the climate doesn't get a lot worse. Before I move on, I'll take your point.
You've come up here explaining all of these amazing possible benefits for the future. How exactly is your side of the house able to viably predict that all of this will be able to happen?
I think we don't have to necessarily predict that it's 100% going to happen. I think the fact that it still exists, and because of the mechanisms I gave you about why people care, it means it's very likely to happen. But what it also means is that even if it doesn't happen, as I've already explained to you at first, even if people the climate does get slightly worse, if it gets to such a dire situation, the people that live on islands that have sunk probably are going to reproduce and have children in the same areas. You just don't feel those tangible impacts. But then third of all, even if you don't believe that these new speculative things are able to help reverse the impacts of climate change, the climate probably just plateaus because A, the population is plateauing, and
had instances, like I've already mentioned to you, people just adapt, they move out, they don't survive, they don't reproduce. Before I move on, I'll take you.
Why can we not have the same development on our side of the house?
I think you don't have the development in your house because you're being born right now, which means that you don't experience any of the things that happen in the future. Moving on then about this thing about technology. What they tell us on this is that there's going to be overdevelopment, there's going to be less jobs. The first response to this is that because you're born in this place, it means that the jobs have already been taken. It means you're born in a world that's already adapted. You're not going to be impacted by this. You probably just take on a degree where that hasn't been overtaken yet. What this looks like is iPhones have come out for 20 years. They've already settled and they play a big part in our lives. It's a quite stable role. The similar thing happens when AI comes out and takes your jobs. They probably just do the same thing. But second of all, I think we flip this material because the development that you have in AI and technology, the advancements, what they look like is that you have recently in vivo changes in genetics. You have CRISPR designer babies which can help remove HIV viruses. You also just have more convenience in life. What this looks like is maybe Siri can now do a lot of things for you. Maybe you have an automatic sandwich maker that just knows how much avocado to put on the toast. What this means is that 1, you're more likely to be born healthy because you A, have gene editing, B, your healthcare increases because you have more technology to sustain this. But also C, when you do get sick, there's just better medicine to help you do this because there's been so much research over so many years that's been funneled into this. Even if you don't believe that the medicine is better, I think you still have more options because there's so much research. More options fundamentally means if you're born in this, you have more choices. This is a really good thing for you. You can satisfy what you want in your own beliefs. What this means then is that you're able to enjoy life healthily. Your parents probably worry less about you. You have a really good life. But also, second of all, your life gets better because of the micro conveniences that I told you about. They make life really cool and really fun, really worth living. On an individual level, you probably experience a funner life where because someone is a robot is making a sandwich for you, you have more time to do things you enjoy, like go out and play sports with your friends. Why then is this a technological advancement going to happen in a positive way? 1, because there's lots of checks and balances. Because it impacts people, it means that people are going to care. There's going to be a lot of attention. There's a big incentive for them to operate in a way that's really good. But also, second of all, if they do want to integrate this technology into people's lives, they have to ensure it happens in a way that people trust and are able to actually utilize. But then thirdly, in 100 years, that's a long time to figure out where things are going. It's a long time to make sure that these checks and balances, make sure that this technology is safe. That's why this technology happens in a really, really good way. Then they tell us this thing about people being unable to make a living out of crops. Note that this is probably talking about the farmers in today's world. 1, in 100 years, this is just going to change. The environment is different, like I mentioned previously in my speech. It's either not that bad or it just, gets even better. But even if the environment does get worse, farmers are probably out of jobs already. If you're reliant on processed food, it means that if you're born, you probably don't want to become a farmer because if you know that you're not going to make a living out of it, you're going to choose a different degree. I just don't think that matters. The final thing that they tell us then is that you're able to now live and focus on your life. I don't think you can do this right now in today's world. Why is this? Because there is so much instability. What this looks like is that you have lots of wars happening. You have so much poverty in developing regions. Why does this change on our side then? I think currently wars are being dominated by superpowers like Russia and Ukraine, or proxy wars. Even in Africa, there's shadow wars by Russia, right? They're still all dominated by superpowers. Civil wars, in the Northern Triangle, in Haiti, they're funded by major superpowers like the US, like China, like India. What this also means then is that there's lots of negotiations currently happening, like Trump trying to get Ukraine to surrender, meaning that these wars, this instability is likely to end in the near future. What this means then, if you're born right now, you're probably going to still have to experience these really terrible impacts. That's really bad. But in 100 years, you're unlikely to be born into this unrest because 1, the superpower has already won. Even if this is objectively bad for you, it still means that you get to live a stable life where you're not scared of having your head shot off every single day. But also, second of all, because of the technological advancement of more destructive weapons, there's just more deterrence. They don't want to, enter super serious war where they have hydrogen bombs bombing your civilians. But also, third of all, people just get more civil over time. You have these wars. What this looks like, it's been a long time since World War II. But also, finally, people are just unlikely to reproduce in times of instability. So even if you don't believe any of that, it's to watch. So proud to affirm.
Thank the speaker for that speech. I'd now like to welcome up the second speaker of the Negating team.
The affirmative team got up here and told you all throughout their case that if people are unable to adapt, they just won't reproduce, and just won't survive. Do you know what that means, Mr. Adjudicator? They're just gonna let people die. The crux of it, if these people, if they can't survive, who cares? We're still living. They cater to a very minority part of society. Two things in this debate. Firstly, I'll be responding to the first and second speaker and the material that they brought up today. And secondly, I'll be extending the substantial portion of my first speaker's speech. Okay, but first responding to the second speaker, they talked a lot about how that thing, and how it's likely to happen because people will just move away, or if not, just not exist and not reproduce. And also they talked about how, the plateauing of the world amount of people in the world. Few responses to this. Firstly, what this means is that uniquely on their side of the house, they just don't get a lot of people surviving, They don't have that culture. They lose, firstly, the amount of people to spread culture, spread stuff. And secondly, they just that's bad. That's a unique harm that we don't have. We help support people to live. And that's a unique benefit that we have. And secondly, it also just means that on our side of the house, we have a lot more knowledge. There's a lot more people alive. Just spread a lot more things. To actuality, we help better this idea of development because there's more brains in the world. Yes. Anyways, they also talked about how, on the point of environment, they talked about it's more likely to happen on their side over time because people are more likely to care. And this care will be gained through things like, protests, lobbying and stuff, etc., etc. Few responses to this. Firstly, we just see on our side of the house, it's just a lot more effective. We see that this care is just more tangible on our side because firstly, it's a, it's something that a lot of people have engagement with right now. We don't want to have to wait around 100 years to try and buy that engagement. Over time, build it. We see on our side of the house. Firstly, it's already strong enough. And secondly, we already have that development currently happening. Before I continue, I'll take a POA.
If the world is so good at developing in the present, as you say, why will it not be way better in the future?
You see, it's actually unlikely to occur because the kind of development that they want and that they want to happen is unlikely. Anyways, moving on. They also talk about technology, and I was thinking that this technology is to be positive and done in a positive way to help improve the environment. This is unlikely for a few reasons. You see, firstly, it's just a lot of the time when they try and build these EV cars, and all these wind farms, they kind of neglect the real big things that create emissions, like coal and stuff, because you need to get the energy for that from somewhere. They don't target the big industries, which means likely in the future they're still going to need to generate this stuff somehow, and you can't just rely on trying to build all this stuff over this long amount of time. Meaning, overall, they detriment the environment. They can't claim all that environmental stuff. Also moving on, they also talked a lot about this idea of wars and wars and improving the social political environment of the world. They also talked about how it's likely that a lot of countries will become liberal over time as they get wealthier. Free response to this. First, you see, this is just unlikely for a lot of these developing countries because a lot of the time the reason they're poor is not due to due to things like corruption, ideological clashes within themselves, and just also a lot of corruption. Meaning, it's likely that these developing countries get left behind on their side of the house. They didn't get access to this what's the word? Adapting. They didn't get access to this adapting. They didn't get access to this development because of all this infighting. They didn't really work towards solving that issue. They kind of just let them die, as I said in the beginning. Which means at the end of this, a lot of the time, they didn't try and care for those people that they can't help because they understand this development. It costs money, it costs brain knowledge. And they understand, they can see that they're not able to save everyone. Whereas on our side of the house, we want to be like this chicken, super chicken. Try and support everyone and save everyone. work for the masses of people. Anyways, moving on. They also talked a lot about, this idea around education, that, degrees and stuff, and this idea of like, in 100 years in the future, you'll just get a degree that helps with technology, stuff like that. Who responds to this? See, firstly, it's just kind of like, kind of just contradicts this idea of, when you're coming from this developed countries, because it's contingent on this idea that, you're going to be born in a place where you're able to actually get, those degrees. And that, what's the word? That capacity to actually get, to actually study and learn. And secondly, it just means, it's more viable on outside house for like more people around the world, because you see, it's more understandable, like if you're born in like, just like a master, what's the word? Like, a standard country like New Zealand, like Canada, as my first speaker said, it's more likely if you're born in these countries, which are more prominent and prevalent on our side of the house, that you're able to access to education and development of your mind on our side of the house. Yes. But before I go on to the first speaker's speech and responding to it, I will take a point, if there is one.
If you are living on a sinking island, why do you not have the capacity or the incentive to adapt?
You see, firstly, if the island is sinking, how am I supposed to adapt? Am I supposed to clear some gills and, swim around in the water? And secondly, a lot of the time, these islands, they don't have the capacity to adapt. They're on an island. They probably fish and stuff. We can assume that these people, they don't have the biggest, like, they don't have all the finances like these other developed countries. They don't have all that stuff, They try to frame it like everyone in the world has like $1 billion, a big-ass brain, and the capacity to, like, fly and, develop all these kinds of things, which is completely unrealistic. They leave out a large portion of society which we work for, which is a unique thing on our side of the house. Anyways, moving to the first point of how, the quality of life is just overall better. And on our side of the house, we brought up a lot of good ideas. We brought up a lot about how, the quality of the environment doesn't actually get better. Like they say, they tried to come up here and mitigate this by going, well, actually, technology will develop in 100 years' time to actually, technology will be developed enough in 100 years' time to mitigate with these things like carbon catching, wind farms, and all of that. Firstly, we just see it's unlikely to make the substantial dent that they say it will. We see it's likely to actually just make, no impact at all. Because yes, although it's good, they're working towards like this, this, what's it called? These wind farms, carbon catching, this hole in the ozone layer is something that's irreversible. The effects of climate change are inherently irreversible, and it's really hard to actually do anything with technology to stop it. So realistically, we see in 100 years' time, a lot of the world will just not be the world. It'll be either on fire, underwater, or exploded. Stay with me now. Secondly, about this idea of, the world becoming more liberal. And this is a big thing to try and lean on because it's contingent, because when the world becomes more liberal, it means they're more wealthy, which means they have the money to adapt. If I can get rid of this, we knock out some of that material. So firstly, as I proved before, it's unlikely that a lot of these countries that they say will become wealthier actually become wealthier because of things like ideological crashes, corruption, and all that kind of stuff. But secondly, it's just more beneficial for these bigger Western countries to stay rich and be the only ones that are rich, because then they only have to worry about their own incentives. They don't have to care for the rest of the world on that side of the house. Meaning that at the end of this debate, the affirmative team only really wants like 5 people to be alive and adapting in 100 years' time. And that's a boring world, because we want to live with millions of people alive and well and happy. Proud to negate.
Thank the speaker for that speech, and I'd now like to welcome up the third affirmative speaker to continue their team's case.
if there are 5 people who adapt on our side, there are probably also 5 people who adapt on their side. And we think it's a really good thing if you're one of those 5 people who adapt versus one of the millions of people who are underwater, who are exploding, who are on fire, as Cadell would like you to tell you. We think that it's a really bad thing when you're one of those people. We think that if you buy all of their material about all of those things happening and only being 5 people left, we think we want to be one of those 5 people. We think that the point at which you're born 100 years earlier, you're not able to change all of these things happening, all of this climate change as an individual. We think that broadly the same number of people probably adapt on both sides. The difference is that you're one of these people who is living after 100 years. You're living after all of these people have already adapted or died. Two things I'm going to do in my speech. Firstly, like on quality of life, and secondly, on like stability and security. So then, firstly, like on quality of life and economics. What have we told you down the line? We've told you, first of all, the fact that like you're probably going to be living in more developed situations because like there is less uncertainty because you can adapt. Secondly, the fact that you're going to there's currently a culture of sacrifice, which is really bad because you're going to have to sacrifice for your kids. But thirdly, then the fact that like you are able to get like more charity growth and that's able to compound. What do we hear in response then? We like broadly heard this idea that you're going to get lots of bad things because there's going to be automation, but we already responded to this at Sarissa. We told you the fact that like this automation is likely to happen in the next like 20, 30 years. It's already happening. The fact of the matter is, if you are born now, then you're going to suffer those consequences. You're going to be one of those people who's put out of a job when a robot comes in and replaces you, so you then no longer have that job. We think that on the comparative, the fact is that those job sectors will just not exist in 100 years. 100 years is a really long time. We think that if you don't need any more farmers, there just won't be any more farmers because they have no opportunity to get jobs. I think that the comparative then is that you're able to go into other jobs in 100 years versus going into these specific jobs now, which we're going to be out of a job. I think that like the point at which you adapt is when the alternative is literally you dying or you having no job. We think that the situations force people to adapt or die. We think that even if they die, it's a good thing because they probably die on both sides. We think that the fact of the matter is you're born after they die. I think that is a uniquely good thing. What else did we hear about like the quality of life? We told you like at Bruce that you probably get better like liberalization on our side of the house because you can like because activism compounds and because small change can probably lead to better awareness by shifting the Overton window. We heard from Cadell that you actually get more, you have like huge amounts of corruption. I think that like that is pretty broadly unclear. And it actually doesn't respond to the like reasons we gave to you at Bruce as to why you're going to have these activisms compounding. We think that if corruption is such a big issue in the status quo, we probably just like have better like activism probably means that you fix that in 100 years. I mean, you probably just get better liberalization. That is probably really good on our side of the house. But also just like it was very unclear. Like they tried to tell us like stuff about land deteriorating, and like we responded to this already when we told you the fact that like if land deteriorates, if no one can be a farmer, we think that just means that you're going to like not go into farming. And at the end of this point, it is very unclear. Like there has been a lack of response to our mechanisms as to why charity like help compounds, as to why you are like unlikely to be born into a culture of sacrifice versus today, and why there's likely to be less uncertainty when you have already adapted to all of these things or died or been put out of a job. That is the fact. That is the world that you have to live in. I'll try to tell you that like you're not going to be in these universities. We think the fact of the matter is that like most people, if they are unable to access jobs, if they are unable to access food, they probably just like die on both sides of the house. We think that insofar as like you're able to build more schools, we think that is probably a good thing on our side because those schools compound. But then like I'll take a point before I move on to the next point of class.
So you talk about how you can ensure that everyone will be able to adapt to this, and that people that people will just they can't adapt just die. But how can you ensure that a large amount, a substantial amount, will be able to adjust to this first climate that you talked about?
Well, I don't think we need to prove that a large amount of people adapt. I think we just need to prove that we're one of those people who do adapt. And I think that is the benefit that we get on our side. That is the benefit that you, being born in 100 years, are likely to face. Even if not a huge amount of people adapt, that is the reality that you're born into. Because as we told you at Circe, if you're living in a really unstable position, you're unlikely to have children in 100 years' time. That probably just like really means that you are unlikely to have like all of those things. Meaning like comparatively, like if you're born now, there are lots and lots of developing countries. As we told you at Bruce, that probably just means that like you are much more likely to be born into a situation where you are more suffering from poverty, where you have these issues such as like corruption that Cadell would like you to tell you are really important. So then I'm going to move on to like the stuff on the environment and like Team Negating's main push here in terms of like stability and security. So they try to tell you like that the environment gets much worse significantly because it is very cheap to do these things that are environmentally bad. We told you like at Sarissa that people probably just generally care about the environment. We think that gets like significantly better on our side when these things become particularly proximate to you, when you can see these like disasters like within the period of 100 years. We think that in the status quo, the reason there is a lack of effort, like a lack of things around climate change, a lack of movements to combat climate change compared to what we would like to see, is the fact of the matter that it is not particularly proximate to people in developed nations. We think that when you get the level of climate refugees, when you get 150 million people, as they're likely to prove, we think that in that 100-year time period, it gets significantly more proximate. You're able to invest a lot more in technology to fix these things, because that is something that, if you don't invest, is going to be meaning that you are out of a house. Your house is blown down by this hurricane. I think that is the reason that you're willing and able to sacrifice cheap goods to vote for a government that is willing to invest in stopping these things. We think that means that you are likely to be able to stop these things, because these developed nations who were previously ignoring climate change or not feeling its effects are now putting all of this money into the technology that Sarissa told you all about. But we also just think that people generally care when there's media telling them about telling them that all these natural disasters exist. I mean, people probably just do care that these are the things that are going to affect them in the next 30, 40, or that are affecting them within this 100-year time period. We think that it is not as irreversible as side negating would like you to claim. We think that there are technologies that you can invest in. We think that even if it is irreversible, as we told you at Bruce, even if these islands sink, they will have already sunk by 100 years. That just looks like the fact that there aren't that many people living in the Pacific. There aren't that many different Pacific islands that you can live on. And, there are, but they will have all sunk if they're going to sink by 100 years' time. You're not going to be born on an underwater island. I think that just means then that you're probably going to be born in these places where there are particular stability, where there is more likely to receive these benefits. But also then, just they told us that at Cadell, that the technology isn't going to be better because you're going to neglect particular things by investing into CV, electric vehicles. And that probably just isn't true insofar as there are lots of different types of technology you can invest into, and when there's just generally more money that you can invest into technology, you probably just get better outcomes overall. I think that probably just means you are able to get more things about the environment. You're able to get more investment into protecting the environment on our side of the house. I'll take a POI if there are any.
Why is it a good thing that people are disincentivized from being farmers?
I think that it's a good thing because people are probably just disincentivized from being farmers on both sides of the house. The difference is that you are already a farmer on side negating, whereas on side affirming, you are not a farmer because farmers have gone out of the sector 100 years ago. You're not going to be a farmer if it's not profitable to be a farmer. I just think that it's very unclear what that's trying to say. So then I think at the end of these both points of clash, and we probably do get levels of development for reasons that have been broadly unresponded to, but also we probably do get better stability on our side when these things become particularly more proximate to individuals who are able to care about it more in the next 100 years. But even if we think that the world gets a lot worse, as side negating would like to prove to you, I think that the kind of life that you are likely to be born into after this 100-year period is the kind of life where people have already adapted, is the kind of life where if they haven't adapted, they have sunken, they have died. We think that the point at which that is the kind of life that you're likely to be born into is the point at which that is just better for you uniquely. Both sides have the same world in 100 years' time. The difference is whether you are born now, whether you are born then, which one is worse for you? I think it is significantly worse when you are born into a world that is about to suffer transitions to automation, that is about to suffer 150 million climate refugees, than one that has already dealt with those issues, than one that has gotten past them. Thank you.
Thank the speaker for that speech. I'd now like to welcome up the third speaker of the negating team to continue their team's case.
Look, if you're confused as to what Team Affirming is trying to argue here, you are not alone. At first, they say that development is the most important thing in this debate and that will eventually develop, yet never explained as to why that was the most important thing in the debate. Secondly, they said that it was a good thing that poor people or impoverished communities die off, which was never explicitly clear why that was a good thing. Thirdly, then they begin to say that these countries are going to liberalize and all of a sudden in 100 years time people are able to kiss their like girlfriend in public and that's like a benefit. It's extremely unclear to me what they're arguing. Okay, I'm going to tell you straight up that the most important thing in this debate is like climate change, essentially, right? And the reason why is because it's something that's always going to be there and always going to be progressively getting worse, even a little bit in the future, right? They claim that the way that they like win this debate is proving people get a better quality of lives, but they essentially relied on the crux, which was development, right? We tell you that development is metric on both sides of the house, although we can sort of agree that it may be like we may potentially be more developed in 100 years' time. We tell you that's never that important for as long as you have people being malnourished or literally dying from heat strokes because of extreme weather conditions. We think that that's likely to be the more proximate incentive for anybody like considering being alive at 100 years' time. We think that you should weigh this debate on certainty, and we think that climate change is definitely more certain than development, which is essentially reliant on a whole gamble. I have 3 things to go over in this debate. Firstly, on just like sort of the lottery and clarification over what being born looks like. Secondly, on climate change. And thirdly, on development and adapting. But yes, I'll take that POI.
The most certain thing in this debate is that if you're born now, you will be born into poverty in a developing nation. Why is that then not the most important thing that we help those people develop?
Look, I'll get into that right now, being born. All right, so they just tell you that the first thing that they say here is that you don't give birth when your island is sinking. Firstly, literally the first thing they told us at Bruce is they tried to push this burden on us that all of a sudden the random lottery draw was going to end you up in a developing nation when literally there are like hundreds of million people in the United States, in the UK. We don't see why it's like likely that you spawn in a random place of Angola, and literally the like reason behind why they said that is because developing countries have high birth rates. There's a tension there, and that needs to be dealt with. We think if this side of the house literally wants to say that developing nations have high birth rates, we think that these islands are likely to have high birth rates as well. But secondly, like why is it wrong that like people just don't give birth when their island is sinking or they don't reproduce? I think that like firstly because there's like probably a lack of like sexual education in that like those type of islands, right? They probably don't like understand that kind of thing. Secondly, because we've seen in the past that there are like increased numbers in climate refugees. And like thirdly, because oftentimes family is like a very cultural thing for these communities, that's why they consider like continue to reproduce. And so we see that like these islands don't end up like dying out, right? Which is the second thing they say here, is that these people will die out and like all of a sudden, like that's a good thing because that means that you're not one of the people on these developing nations. First of all, I just like proved why that was wrong, right? These people are still likely to give birth. It's still like equally as likely that you would end up in that situation and you end up impoverished anyway. But secondly, note that it's like their entire push on like, oh, it's okay because like these people either die out or they adapt anyway is still extremely harmful, right? Because we rely on these people in general, right? It's extremely ignorant to say like, oh, it's okay if all of the people from Kiribati die out because like, at least we're still alive, right? No, we rely on Kiribati for our fisheries. We rely on different countries, for our trade. They ignored that entire material, right? And that was super important. But secondly, note that these like communities are often people of color. We think if your best case scenario is that people of color die, we don't think that you're necessarily like winning this debate. That's not necessarily a preferable counterfactual. But also note the material that we gave you at Cadell about how we lose like all of this like cultural enrichment that you're like never able to get when these communities die out if they say so. The last thing that they say is that people will be relocated. But again, we tell you that people spend years in refugee camps. People, like, oftentimes the culture will die out, and that's extremely bad. We think that their best case scenario is actually still a really bad thing, even if, because we rely on these developing nations so much. All right. Secondly, then, I move on to, like, a push about climate change, right? Because, like I stated in my introduction, you should always weigh climate change more heavily because that's always the thing that's always going to exist, right? Economists and like people who make predictions are wrong all the time. They're wrong all the time about development, right? But climate change is all a pre-existing thing that will always exist, that will always continue to get worse, even if it's little by little, right? So this is the most important thing they needed to deal with in this debate. I'm going to tell you why they never dealt with it adequately. Well, the first thing that they say here is that like we're going to use like research and science. We're going to use things like EVs and wind turbines and all of these different chemicals, right? In order to reverse it. We note that like these, like oftentimes these
errors that are made like in climate change and things getting significantly worse are like significantly impossible to reduce, right? Because you can't unburn a hole through the ozone layer. You can't pull an island back up from underground the ocean. Like, we just think that it's like extremely uncharitable of them to say that you can just like sort of fix these problems using like electric vehicles, and a guy like driving in his Tesla is gonna fix like the sinking of like an island in Polynesia, right? But note that science and using these sort of mechanisms is symmetric, right? And even if they claim that they're able to get more development in terms of science, note that they also have to deal with the harm of climate change worsening on their side of the house. So even if they are able to develop more, we think that it'll never be able to compete with the worsened like climate change and the worsened state of the world. But, okay, and then the last push that they give to you underneath climate change is that people will simply just choose not to go in industries like farming. I'm sorry, like if you know that like your industry, a crucial industry like farming that literally provides food and sustenance to your people, we have given you like 6 reasons why this is so harmful at Alex that needed to be addressed, right? That's bad because we told you that there's likely to be an over-reliance on processed foods, which is why that development thing is not likely to be good. Secondly, there's likely to be oversaturated industries, right? That essentially means that people choose not to be farmers. Maybe they go into AI or tech, and there's only a restricted amount of like applications going into these industries anyway, which means that there's likely to 3 be more unemployment, have a more unstable economy in the first place, which this essentially admits to. And note that this climate change point is extremely crucial, right? For all the reasons that we give you at Alex about why like people are unable to like sustain themselves, why health facilities crumble, and why we're no longer able to live off of healthy sustenance food. That point should be weighed very heavily in the debate, and they never dealt with it adequately. Lastly then, on development and adapting. The first thing that I want to note to you here is that this is never the most important thing. Sure, they might get some degree of development on their side of the house, more so, but we tell you that this is never important than the lives that we're able to save on our side of the house, right? But also, note the material that we gave you on overdevelopment, right? It's which leads to an over-reliance on AI and over-reliance on processed foods and an inability for people to think for themselves. We think that's really bad, but at the end of this debate, I think what we essentially need to prioritize is the fact that development is uncertain and that climate change will forever be certain, and that was the material that they never contended with. That was the material that they were unable to respond to, and that is why we win this debate today.
Thank the speaker for that speech. I will now reverse the speaking order and welcome up the reply speaker, the negating team, to conclude their team's case.
Affirmative has come up here and spent a combined 24 minutes pushing the notion that the future in 100 years is going to be some sort of amazing world that everyone will be able to thrive in, especially someone who is just born. Look, we just do not think this is true. We just do not think this is the case. Their whole case is contingent on their prediction that society is adaptable and able to actually combat these rising issues. We think that the world they push is hyperbolic, and it's not true. But, okay, let's assume it is actually correct. And let's live in their best case scenario. Even then, they can still not claim all of the benefits that they claim are unique, right? And this is for a couple of reasons, and the reasoning here is threefold. Firstly, the people who they argue will be able to adapt on these sinking islands are exactly the types of people who can't. Why? Because these are the people who are in these developing countries without access to the internet. So they're not going to be able to go on sinkingisland.com and find out whether or not their island is actually sinking. Secondly, they begin to push the agenda of unity on their side of the house. How, all of the political unrest that we claim is unlikely and it's not actually going to happen because, it's just not going to happen, right? But I think it's really interesting how AF does not realize that this issue is actually more of a threat in the future and on their side of the house. In 100 years' time, countries' ideologies will still clash. That is just a fact. It's not going to go away. What Now the only difference is that they have these innovative and more developed weapons that they can use for political unrest and use for war. Especially when these clashes happen, they start thinking that, oh, nothing's going to really happen about it, but it's just untrue because now they have more power and now they're able to actually have more influence in international relations. Thirdly, climate change is still an issue, and this is not actively combated on their side of the house. I think it is quite unfair for Affirmative to try and claim that in like 100 years' time, that climate change will be effectively managed and mitigated through people protesting or something like that. Look, this is just like not viable. No matter how hard these people protest and like try to push for active change, it's not going to really do anything. Or it might somehow do something, but it's not going to be effective enough to mitigate the problem. Climate change was like discovered about like 100 years ago, and it's still clearly like a really big issue today. It's not effectively like managed today. So how can they claim that in 100 years that's going to change? But okay, let's flip this and look at our side of the house, and we'll see why it's clearly built better. Firstly, climate change is not as bad as it will be in 100 years when like the scorching temperature causes a newborn baby to expose to life-threatening circumstances. But secondly, also because of the harmonic balance between like nature and technology we have in our society today. Our side is really unique because when we like look out this window right here, you're able to see technology, right? But you're also able to see this really beautiful nature. We like to think of this as like the equilibrium, or like the Goldilocks zone of technology and like nature, if you will. This is like really unique on our side of the house because on their side of the house, in this time, it's going to become this really overdeveloped world. Let's take a step back and now like weigh up the outcomes of both sides of the house. Av pushes three main things. Firstly, a developed technological world. And secondly, if you skip like the developing process, you're now born into this developed world, which is a lot better. And thirdly, we live in a better world on their side of the house. But if we are comparative, we will see that the developed world that they're trying to push is symmetric. But uniquely, we nurture culture through having these like sinking islands. Now they're able to like, they're not like pushing to go to USA, right? But we're also really unique. We have the unique benefit of capacity for social change. Now, irregardless if we are developed or not, we still win because of all of the unique benefits that we have on our side of the house. We win on certainty. We win because we know what world we are living in today. We win on scale, we win on severity. We win because I can stand right here and I can tell you what this world is like, but I cannot tell you what it will be like in 100 years. So all of the claims they make are all predictions. It's all not possible, or it could be possible. How would I know? Can you know? You can't know. No one can truly know, which is why I oppose. Proud to oppose. Thank you.
I'd like to welcome up the final speaker of the debate.
Their weighing uncertainty was never the most important thing in this debate. Of course, they can tell us what's happening right now. They need to prove why the things we're trying to claim is unlikely, and that's where this debate takes place. But notice that this debate does not take place in two separate worlds. It takes place in the same world, just at different stages in history. So if you think that there are positive trends in the present, for instance, what First Op said about culture and liberalism in the status quo, then you believe that we're able to reap those benefits of this positive trend without living through the struggle. However, for the parts of the status quo that were getting worse in the present, all the outcomes from opposition were inherently short-termist. Maybe it's true that in 50 years' time, islands sink or people get unemployed due to automation, but no, you only suffer from this if you are born now, because that means that you'll never have, which means like you lose your house when you're 50, for instance. Alternatively, if you were born in 100 years' time, it was your great-grandparent who had to suffer this job loss, but you now live a great life as a result. Two things I'm going to talk about then. First, on things that are getting better in the status quo. Second, on things that are getting worse in the status quo and why we win on both rounds. First, on things that are getting better in the status quo. We have three sort of areas that we talked about. First, on culture, the key push from our side was that there is great amounts of liberalizing happening due to not only just the economic benefit, but also just political activism that happens more generally in the status quo. But note here, the difference in this debate was that the kind of activism that exists is inherently dangerous. When the kinds of countries in the status quo are ones that are insanely conservative and have very harsh punishments for people who deviate from the cultural norm, then it's a very high risk to you to live in the status quo. Alternatively, the slow trends that we see building in the long run means that in 100 years' time when you're born into this, you live in a far more culturally better society. Second, on stability. This is when we talked about wars, but the only response to this came out in reply, right? I think it's far too late for this, and what you believe at the end is that all of Sarissa's material about why war gets far better, because the kinds of weapons that exist increase the deterrence, that stands at the end of this debate. I want to outline here that war is about as big of a problem for most people as climate change. When people's houses are being devastated by bombs, when people are losing their loved ones because they're being slaughtered in the streets, that's the worst outcome for these people. It's akin to the same extent if you believe that wars are far better on our side of the house or happen to a far less degree, then you believe that the extent of harm that we carry is the same, for instance, comparable to their material on climate change. Lastly, about health. The only opposition material was about processed foods and speculative super diseases that might happen in response to climate change. But notice here that all of our material was concrete and grounded. Things like active technology that happens that mean that you're less likely to be born with genetic diseases. Things like CRISPR, which mean that you're having better lives. Things like the natural flow of just medicinal development that means that a lot of diseases are far less proximate to you. The reason this is debate winning is firstly, it co-opts a lot of their material about what they're telling us about the short-term benefits and trends, which means you buy that as a benefit on our side of the house. But secondly, it's just far better for a majority of people, right? No one's wanting to live 100 years ago when the risk of dying from influenza was very close to 100%. That's why it's far better on our side of the house. Secondly, on things that are getting worse in the status quo, let's clarify this motion at the top of this clash. This debate is not about preferring the world in 100 years. It's specifically about preferring to be born in that world in 100 years. So maybe it's true that at our worst case, material that we said about people losing their homes in climate refugee camps in the short term are very harmful in actuality. But as a person, you would far prefer to be born in that world because there's no risk that you're in here in the first place. On economics then, the big push inside opposition ran on the example of farming, right? But what would we tell you in response? Firstly, it's happening in the status quo to a far greater extent than it might happen in the future. Things like automation, which are driving farmers out, that's happening right now. And that means that if you are born right now, you suffer those harms. In 100 years' time, we live in a society that adapts. But secondly, on climate change, what we told you is just so much stuff about why grounded material, about why technology gets better, why it's likely reversible with things like ozone regeneration and carbon capture. It's always going to be better in the long term, but even the short-term harms are going to be cut out for those reasons proposed.
Thank you very much, both teams, for a great debate. I'd like to invite cross board, shake hands, then I'll ask you to exit the room.
One of you do me a big favour.